It's pretty well established that glucose spikes can impair immunity almost immediately. Immune cells moving towards their target is stunted by high sugar.
Today, we're talking about the 10 surprising worst foods for your overall metabolic health and blood sugar. If you want to find out what they are, stay tuned. Well, we're going even deeper on the topic of metabolic health. It's been a few months now that I've been using the levels monitor, and you're one of the co-founders and the medical director of Levels. And people had a really great chance on our last podcast episode to get the big picture on metabolic health. We'll repeat some of that information, but today I really want to focus on foods to pay attention to, and also how we can make things healthier and other aspects that also impact our glucose. So I want to just jump right in, because you guys wrote a really interesting article recently, and it was called 5 Surprising Blood Sugar Spikers. I think one thing that when anybody's using a continuous glucose monitor and they're trying to dial in their health, regardless of their keto, vegan, vegetarian, anything in between, vegan diet, whatever, the message from the last podcast we had and today's podcast is you can do any diet in an optimized way, or any diet can also be done in a non-optimized way. And when you dial in your own personal diet and you get into the right blood sugar range, you're not just focused on avoiding chronic disease, because that's a big part of it, but you're now talking about how to create the best health ever, because you're living in that optimal range. So let's jump right in, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to walk us through these 5, and we may pause and go in different directions and use it as an opportunity to explain concepts that you guys write a lot about. So 5 surprising blood sugar spikers. Number 1, grapes. Okay, why is grapes one of the first foods that was listed as a blood sugar spiker and something that would impact your glucose in a way that maybe, if grapes are a big part of your diet, you might want to be paying attention to?
Yeah, grapes was fascinating to me because, here's a fruit. We have a lot of people logging different types of fruit, oranges, apples, berries, but grapes was just absolutely off the charts. And when you look at the nutrition of grapes, they do have about 10 to 20 grams of sugar per cup. So that is a lot. And I think one of the key things that might be unique about grapes is that we kind of rarely eat them with other foods. Like, we don't really pair grapes with nut butter or with yogurt even, or with oatmeal. It's kind of unusual. So you're often eating them alone. And I think I've heard this concept of naked carbohydrates. I think grapes are often being eaten like that. They're just being eaten naked. They're not being paired with other things that can blunt the glucose response. And the things that really can be helpful with fruit in blunting the glucose response is adding fat, protein, or fiber. So that could look like adding chia seeds or a nut butter or something like that. And we rarely do that with grapes. So I think that might be one of the big reasons for it. But it was pretty much off the charts. So in writing this article, what we did was we looked at essentially amongst our 10,000 or so beta customers, we looked at all the logs that people had written on the app of sort of what foods that they were checking with their continuous glucose monitor. And we looked at the bottom 40, so which scored the absolute worst. And yeah, grapes.
Right, because on the app, on the app interface, we will have like a little screenshot that people can look at. You get a score for everything that you log.
Yeah.
1 out of 10.
Yeah.
And it's not about being perfect. It's more just giving you an idea of what is the impact to your glucose. So 1 is a food that, if you want to use traditional words, like kind of had a negative impact for you and spiked you very heavily. And we don't want these roller coasters that are there.
Exactly. Our goal for optimal health, optimal longevity is to keep our glucose more flat and stable throughout the day. We do not want these huge ups and down spikes, these peaks and valleys, which is called high glycemic variability. We want to avoid that. We know that glycemic variability is associated with weight gain and future risk of disease like heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. And so keeping things more gentle and flat is really what we want. So in the Levels app, how that's going to show up is by getting what we call a better zone zone score. So a zone is essentially a composite metric of what's happening to your glucose after you eat something. Glucose will rise if there's carbohydrates in your food, and then it'll come back down. And we want that to be, in a healthy short period of time. We want it to go up and come down, usually within about 2 hours. And we want that spike, that delta from before you ate to the peak after your meal, to be smaller rather than larger. And so of all the fruits that people log, grapes were just, off the charts. And so I think there's a lot of learning in that. And like you said, this is not about a judgment of like, oh, you're hurting your body by eating this, or you should never eat these again. It's really, I like to say that every glucose curve tells a story. Every glucose curve is a learning opportunity. And for me, the learning opportunity with that is think about ways to pair grapes with other things. Like, could you add them to some sort of fat source or fiber source, like a chia pudding or something like that, to maybe offset some of the glucose spike? Maybe just make sure that you're eating your grapes before or after movement. Like when you move even for 20 minutes after a meal, you can bring down that glucose spike. And so just building a context around these foods so that you're not getting such a heavy hit of a glucose spike.
What's really interesting is that you are right. I think people just eat grapes alone. But if you think about like a charcuterie board, right? Charcuterie board, like traditionally, might have, cheeses on there. It'll have some proteins, usually some versions of salami type, proteins that are there, especially in the Mediterranean. I love going to Italy, and everywhere you go, they have these different charcuterie boards. They'll have olives, so they'll have good quality fats. They might even have like a little honeycomb that's on there, and some herbs depending on what region. We were down in Sicily last 2 years ago. I took my family and my parents on this big trip. We had all sorts of different herbs that they added to our charcuterie board. And then the grapes were there, but they were just one small little part of it.
Exactly. And I would bet that if people were eating these in the context of a charcuterie board, it would have been a better response. Something unique about this article was that we were looking for foods that were logged in isolation. Yeah. So only foods that were logged by themselves. So that does change the data a little bit. But I exactly what you're talking about, that is essentially a balanced meal in a sense from a macronutrient perspective, the charcuterie board. Often nuts are on there as well. And so you're getting those healthy fats, those whole food fats, the protein, et cetera, to sort of offset some of this just huge load of glucose coming into the system.
Yeah. And right now you have 10,000 users that are in part of that beta. I'm one of them. And for everybody who's just wondering, I mean, I have long sleeves on, but you could show it on your arm. If they're watching on YouTube, you have a sticker on and there's a sensor underneath. That sensor is streaming data to your phone, and on the phone, there's the Levels app, which you and your team have created, which is basically helping you make sense of this data and giving you actionable insights. Because I used to use a Dexcom, which is a continuous glucose monitor, and most people know that because diabetics would use it to help them manage their, blood sugar. But now people who are sort of in the biohacking / optimal living community are using it too. But the challenge is Dexcom's a great company. Abbott is a great company, but you can't really get actionable insights from their apps. So you guys build an app that really help people make meaning out of this information to actually know, hey, this food does this, or this food does that, or this stress level does this, or when I don't get sleep, here's where my blood sugar is. And so it's easier to make lifestyle changes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We are building a software on top of this amazing continuous data stream that helps you contextualize what's happening and understand the holistic nature of metabolic health and glucose control. It's not just about the amount of carbs you're eating, because carbs affect each person differently. And we spoke about this on the last podcast, but really the concept of biochemical individuality. You and I, we're drinking the same juice right now, but we could have very, very different responses to that because of internal factors like microbiome composition and things like that. So knowing how it really affects you personally is important. But then all the other lifestyle things you mentioned, how much we're exercising and moving our bodies and our muscles each day, how much or how little sleep we're getting, and the quality of our sleep, the stress that we're under can have a huge impact on our glucose responses to the same food. Eating an apple when we're stressed versus when we're not stressed can look very, very different. So putting all these things into context so that we can ultimately build a metabolic toolbox, understand which tools are at our disposal to keep that glucose more flat and stable more of the time. Maybe that means taking some deep diaphragmatic breaths before you eat a higher carb meal. Maybe it means always taking a 20 or 30-minute stroll after dinner if you know you're eating something that spikes you. Maybe it means eating, the higher carb foods that you like after a good night of sleep rather than after a poor night of sleep. But building that metabolic awareness, I think, just really can help people have a little bit more control over this really important part of health, which is our blood sugar levels, which are becoming a problem for most Americans at this point, with 128 million Americans having type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. And I think a lot of this stems from us having very little awareness or closed loop biofeedback into how our foods are affecting our bodies, and then what we can do about it.
We're going through the sophistication of wellness. If we look at the 60s movement and the hippie movement, and also there was also Alice Waters and the farm to table movement that was starting around that time too. But if I would look at the earliest trends in the United States, of course, we had the demonization of fat, right? That happened, and I think that started in about the 50s. And we've done some episodes on that. And then you kind of had the rise of the low fat movement, which meant that there was putting sugar in a lot of different foods to make them taste good. And that continued, it's still kind of continuing, but I think it probably really peaked in the 80s, 90s. But along with that, you also had the rise of sort of sub movements of like vegetarian. So a lot of times when you said you're like eating healthy, people say, "Oh, are you a vegetarian?" And I actually grew up a vegetarian. I grew up vegetarian, but I actually was a pretty processed food vegetarian, except for that one meal a night, which was my parents making good home cooked Indian food and making, who even knew back then, but they would be making resistant starch white rice, because that just was how we made it. They made it in the pressure cooker, and then they kept it in the refrigerator, and then they would serve it out throughout the week. But my mom was just saving time, and they would make lentils in the pressure cooker. They would do all these, things. So that was the one meal that I actually got good food in. But the rest of the day I was eating Doritos and Twix and other stuff, because I was just like a kid, not probably too different than a lot of people that were there. Anyways, I digress. So we had the vegetarian movement, and then recently we've had, the rise of, whether it's been things like Atkins and then keto and then carnivore, we still think of things as a dietary framework of, is this good or is this bad? What are you? What am I? And really, we're going through the sophistication of it to say, you can eat any way that you want to, because there's a lot of different things that go into it. Your view of how different foods impact the world, your feeling on animal rights, right? And, animal suffering, that's there, because that's a very real thing. Your own bioindividuality, your own genetics, your grandparents' microbiome that's still kind of present inside of you. And now it's not anything is good or bad. It's just about how you want to dial in. And there's also, we're getting away from this idea of cheat days, right? If you want to enjoy something, if you decide to have something that's a little bit more sugar inside of it, great, have it, enjoy it. Don't think of it as something bad, but know your baseline so that you can return back to good health. Is that how you see it? Anything you want to add on top of that?
I think all of that is exactly right. And the way I really frame food is that food is molecular information. And really, when we go out and eat, we're choosing what molecular information we want to put into our bodies, because that information is going to determine how our genes are expressed, how our hormonal pathways are signaling, and how our cell biology works. And now that we understand, we're at this exciting point in the scientific sort of world where we really understand cell biology on a very, very deep level, and how food compounds are interacting with that. And so that's really, the framework through which I, go to the grocery store. I'm going to the grocery store on a micronutrient molecular information hunt. Like, how can I get these things in my body, polyphenols, antioxidants, micronutrients, to serve these cellular biology pathways? And really, glucose fits right into that. I know that high glucose spikes and big peaks and valleys in my day, that is molecular information that is damaging to my goals and my overall health and longevity. And so I'm looking for opportunities to really keep that down. I know that those big spikes are going to cause big insulin releases, change my hormonal milieu in my body. They're going to cause oxidative stress and glycation and potentially inflammation. And so, you mentioned that wellness is becoming very sophisticated. I think that's true. And I think it's it can be kind of seen as a luxury to have access to this level of sophistication, like tools, wearables, things like this. And that's true. I think part of the reason it needs to be sophisticated is because we're kind of dealing with a sophisticated adversary or enemy with, and I don't want to use the word enemy, but we're in a very complex food ecosystem where we are being told that so many different things are healthy. There's loud voices in the nutrition space. We have, a government that subsidizes disease-promoting foods. You really can't walk into the store. I mean, you go walk up to a box of oatmeal and it says heart healthy, good form of fiber. Well, that might be causing a 100-point glucose spike in you. So it's a sophisticated food landscape. And I do think part of the reason why I really like wearables is not because I want to be hooked up to technology for the rest of my life. It's because I feel like it's important to have sophisticated tools in the face of a food and just general cultural ecosystem that is essentially a treadmill towards chronic disease unless you do something differently, unless you have a little bit more information. And so my hope is that over time, as we understand how more awareness of how food is affecting our bodies and how that molecular information is affecting our bodies, these tools will be shown to be effective prevention tools, and they will become widely accessible to larger populations. Yeah.
One of the greatest things that has happened over the last few years is you start to see wellness is going very mainstream. And with that, more people are interested, especially after a big year like last year in the pandemic, where we had an opportunistic virus that was taking advantage of all these chronic health issues that so many people had. And there's more companies that are trying to meet that demand. Now, if you're watching this podcast, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a consumer that's looking for the best options. Whether you have kids or don't have kids, you're looking for the best way to eat healthy, but also not have it totally take over your life. So the reason I love this list, and we're going to continue walking through it, is even for me, there was a lot of things. The list is called 5 surprising. One thing I liked about wearing levels and still wearing levels is that there's many things I thought I was making good choices, and I didn't know how certain things were spiking me. So it was surprising to me because as the wellness industry has grown, more people are making things. And it was amazing to see how even sometimes something that says keto could be completely spiking my blood sugar, because it's easy to just write something on a label, but then you don't understand what ingredients are inside of there that are actually maybe doing the opposite of what they intended or what the consumer intended. So this is all about knowledge and awareness and having you be able, just like it's like nutrition facts. You look at nutrition facts, that's one layer of a story. Now, when you can look at your glucose response, that's another layer of the story because everybody's different. And just because the nutrition facts looks kind of clean doesn't mean that it's operating that way inside of the body. So let's go to that. You mentioned oatmeal, right? Let's go to that. There's so many people that think that oatmeal can be an incredible part of a way of starting, breakfast off and having the day, and has that heart healthy box. So why was oatmeal number 2 in terms of the worst scoring individual foods from this database that you pulled from?
Yeah, this one was not a shocker because in the beginning of the company, when the 5 co-founders, me and my 4 co-founders were all together, we did an experiment where we each had a packet of just the Quaker instant oats. So it was like plain oats in a mug, fills up like a third of the mug, and you microwave it. And universally, our glucose all went above a 60-point rise. So from baseline to the peak after the meal, it was 60 milligrams per deciliter. For context, I generally don't really want to go above 30 points ever with a meal above my baseline. I'm trying to stay within that range of like a gentle peak. And so 60 is huge. That's a lot of glycemic variability. And over time, if you're doing that day after day after day for 30 years, there's really no question that that's going to contribute to insulin resistance and whatnot.
Which can lead to what? Just as a reminder for people.
Yeah. So, insulin resistance, which is the process whereby, just briefly, when your glucose rises in your blood, your pancreas releases insulin to help you take that glucose out of your bloodstream into the cells so that it can be used for energy or if there's excess stored. Over time, as you spike your glucose over and over and over again, which is what the average American is doing with our highly processed food diet and being told to eat, six small meals a day or lots of snacks, you're having these spikes all the time, these insulin spikes all the time. And over time, the cells say, oh my gosh, this is so much insulin that we're seeing. We're going to become resistant to it because it's too much glucose for us to process. And then the body overcompensates by making more insulin. And so you end up getting high insulin levels. And then over time, the glucose starts rising in the bloodstream. That extra insulin can't, push more glucose into the cells. And that's really the pathway towards type 2 diabetes. And what we've learned is that process of high insulin, high glucose levels underlies most of the chronic illness we're seeing in our country, most of the big killers that we're seeing in America and the Western world right now. So obviously
Alzheimer's,
diabetes,
cancer.
Exactly. Obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, chronic liver disease. I mean, we're seeing literally fatty liver disease in children now, heart disease, stroke, and then so many other things that don't necessarily kill you, but that make life more difficult. So things like infertility. The leading cause of infertility in the United States is polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a metabolic condition where insulin is stimulating the ovaries to make too much testosterone. And we get infertility and menstrual irregularity, erectile dysfunction, insulin resistance in the small vessels of the penis cause a lack of blood flow. And we get erectile dysfunction, depression, anxiety, acne, chronic pain, gout. It's amazing. So it's really underlies so many of these things and very directly is related to 8 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. So something we all want to be thinking about. So what's and so sort of circling back to oatmeal, we saw these really consistent results of high glucose values after eating oatmeal for breakfast. And a couple things with that. So in terms of optimizing this, does this mean we should never eat oatmeal? Not necessarily, but it means we can definitely learn from it. So there's different types of oatmeal. There's rolled oats, which are sort of a processed, I would say, semi-refined version of oats. There's also steel cut oats, which are less refined. And then there's groats, which is actually like the whole, it's a very hearty form of oatmeal that's almost like chewy and feels like a grain. We've definitely seen better results with the steel cut oats and the groats. You can also modify the oatmeal. So, avoid adding the sugar or drinking it with a glass of OJ and add the fat, protein, and fiber. So some nut butter, some walnuts, some chia seeds, maybe some flax seeds, and maybe a few low glycemic berries. That's going to look very different than just pounding rolled oats, which is basically going to turn into straight sugar in the bloodstream. And just take a walk after breakfast, 15-minute, 20-minute walk, get moving, start soaking up some of that glucose into the muscles. There's lots that you can do to really modify that response. But and all of this is anyone can do this with or without a continuous glucose monitor. But what I love about the tool of having the CGM, the continuous glucose monitor, is that all that food marketing that's on the box, heart healthy, great source of whole grains, high in fiber, that's all great, but that does not mean any of that's true for your body or that it's actually having a positive effect. And an objective data stream cuts right through all that marketing language and tells you exactly whether it's right for your body or not. And to have that power so you can actually have agency in the face of all of this food marketing, I think that's really invaluable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's more and more people aware of oats. And I just see a general movement. I'm talking about in the very sort of small wellness community that we kind of all are in the podcast world of me and Dr. Hyman and Max and Kelly and, all these really great people that we're surrounded with, many of them that are in LA. But what I still see a lot of, which this links to, is I still see a lot of people drinking oat milk. Talk to us about oat milk, because that was one of the first things that showed up in my score as one of the lower items that was there. And usually oat milk is one of those things where you're not usually having it by itself. There's not a lot of people that drink straight oat milk. They're usually mixing it into a smoothie or having an oat milk latte. But how have you seen oat milk, in comparison to oatmeal?
We've actually, some of our most amusing Instagram posts from members, we are often resharing people's screenshots that they post on Instagram. Some of the most, hyperbolic, like, I can't believe this, are the oat milk responses. Like, I thought this was healthy. I paid a lot for this. And, it's a refined grain milk. And so it's not really surprising. But yeah, we've seen a lot of high responses with unsweetened oat milk. And
if I could add one thing to that, and listen, I appreciate that, dairy sales, commercial dairy, factory farming sales are down like a lot. I think they're down, they've been going down like 25% compared to like a few years ago. And so I want to give credit to all the alternative milks that are out there, but oat milk in particular, I think two things to be mindful of. I thought I was getting unsweetened oat milk, so I thought that was better. But the interesting thing is when you look at the process of how they make oat milk, they have to, I guess it's in the fermentation process or the making of it originally, that there are sugars that are added then. So it's interesting. You could say unsweetened, but then if you look at the sugars on the back of the label of Oatly and these are great brands, which have good intentions, but maybe just not aware, there is still sugar in them. It's different than, for instance, unsweetened almond milk, right? Which I switched back to that. From a much cleaner brand that doesn't have emulsifiers and gums and other things. And then the other aspect is that there's an organization that does glyphosate-free certification. And they said the highest ranking healthy food that always comes back as having glyphosate contamination is oats. That surprisingly is one of the biggest ones that they have a really hard time, passing the no glyphosate reported in the testing of it.
That is so interesting. And man, would I be excited about a continuous glyphosate monitor, because I think that would be really fascinating. I mean, I think we deserve to know what's in our food, and that's one that gets so hidden. It's certainly not on the label, but this is just the tough part is that, 49% of Americans are trying to lose weight each year. Like if you look at just the previous 12 months, 49% of Americans are trying to lose weight. So people are trying to do better. They're committing to making choices that will hopefully help lose weight and be healthier, but it's not working. I mean, every year we're getting sicker in the United States, we're getting heavier, we're getting more depressed. That's just objective data, despite spending $3.8 trillion on healthcare costs every year, more than any other developed nation in the world. So the effort is there and it's not working. And, thinking about something like oat milk, a lot of people I would bet are going out and saying, well, I'm switching from dairy, I'm going to a plant-based milk, and this is a healthy choice for me. And they are trying, and they are spending more money, and they are maybe drinking something they don't like as much. And yet they might not realize that that's actually contributing to essentially not helping them with their goal, whether it's weight loss or whatever it is. And that's where I think like holding up a mirror to some of these foods with objective data, that's an amazing step forward. Like what I'm really excited about with the wearable movement is that we sort of in a grassroots way inspire the industry to create products that actually, are going to serve our goals, whether it's weight loss, whether it's whatever. I don't think necessarily the companies know that this is what's happening to people's glucose with this.
They don't. They're run by well-intentioned people that are trying to do the best and solve certain problems. And
exactly,
it's not a big conspiracy. They just don't know.
Exactly. And so I'm really excited to see what happens there. And I can really imagine as more and more people use some of these products, like a continuous glucose monitor, what the future of sort of meal planning looks like and recipe planning. Like right now we go to a recipe blog and there's multiple paragraphs written about the health effects of the recipe, and you kind of take it at face value. And there's reviews, of course, from people who have tried them. But what would it look like if those recipes were all reviewed by people's glucose responses to them? And you could actually use that objective data as a way to make choices and know that it's actually, no matter what it says or what the marketing is, that it actually has worked for people. So that's a future that I'm really excited about, and the way that it might gently nudge the industry to create products that actually are having less of this glycemic impact on people.
And I love the idea of metabolic flexibility. I was sharing about that a little bit. And, what I love about being able to wear a monitor is then my fiance and I, we went down to Mexico to visit some friends. And that weekend, we wanted to go on a little bit of a food tour. And everything in Mexico City is tacos. Everywhere we went, it's like the high-end places, the low-end places, the street food. It's all different forms of tacos that they have. And corn tends to be one of those foods that spikes you up, right? We could talk a little bit more about that. And that weekend I went in knowing, and I told my fiance, I was like, we got to make sure we don't stay up late, right? We get really good sleep, which we'll come back to. And let's also just be a little bit mindful of like how much we drink. Because it's also, we were traveling in the context of COVID. And while I'm not particularly too worried about getting COVID, I do also know I could quickly get it. You know, a few nights of late night drinking, dancing, partying, some alcohol, not sleeping well, and then you're in the right sort of framework, high blood sugar, you can get COVID just like that.
Your immune system is just like each word you're saying. Yeah,
exactly. Your immune system's going down. You're more open to whether it's the flu, coronavirus, whatever it is. You're open for those types of things. And I was like, I really don't want to get sick on the trip. So we just adjusted. And you know what? My blood sugar was all over the place on that trip. But I knew it. I understood it. And I know what my baseline is like. So when I came back, I knew how to just do the regular things that I do to start feeling good. And it was still a fun, enjoyable trip. And it didn't feel like I'm coming back thinking I need to burn these calories off, right? It felt like I'm indulging. I got the point. And instead, where previously I might have like 5 tacos in one serving, I had 1. And I felt like, wow, that was great. I get the point of this. This makes sense. Like, this was good. I gave my taste buds. I got to try it. I got that dopamine hit, and I moved on to something else. So, a lot of times you hear, and I saw this first when we got introduced, when I was talking about levels and continuous glucose monitors with other practitioners, they were like, I just don't want people to be over obsessed. And I was like, actually, when you do it, you get the opposite. You get freedom. You don't become obsessed. You get freedom to know how foods respond to you, and you place less judgment on decisions that you want to make because you're making them consciously versus having no clue what happens when you eat certain things.
Absolutely. I think that is such an important point. I think there's potential for any tool out there to be, used for good or for evil, right? And I think that there's concern that the more we're tracking these things, like you said, are we going to become like obsessed with tracking everything and we can't take a bite without thinking about glucose? And I have actually had very much the similar experience to you, which is a level of food freedom that I feel like I've never had before, because we spend most our lives, I think, for many of us with food in this open loop feedback system where we try something, we try an intervention like, I'm going to add chia seeds to my diet. And it's very hard to know what's actually happening. Like, is it helping? Is it hurting? Is my weight up or down a pound the next day? 6 months from now, you might get a cholesterol test and it might be 10 points different. How do you know that intervention that you chose to do is helping or not helping? When you can have closed loop biofeedback, so moving nutrition from this notoriously open loop system to closed loop, where you can actually have a 1-to-1 relationship between like tacos and what's happening to my body, all of a sudden, that sort of questioning and mystery and thinking about it and is it working, is it not, a lot of that goes out the window. You have an answer of whether it's working for you. And that can be very, very like liberating. The first day, our CEO of Levels, Sam, the first day he'd been eating oatmeal for a decade for breakfast. And he's the type of person who like mid-morning would have kind of this like mid-morning slump, need an extra cup of coffee. And he kind of misattributed that to like, I'm just a person who's tired in the morning, or, it's probably because I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, or maybe I had poor sleep, or maybe I just need more caffeine. He put on the glucose monitor, had his oatmeal, and realized he was going up 100 points and then crashing down. And that post-meal crash is because we release so much insulin to a big glucose spike that the body soaks up all that glucose and sometimes overshoots. So he crashed down, and right when he was in the crash zone, which is like an hour and a half after the meal, that's when he was tired. That's when he needed the extra cup of coffee. That's when he felt a little jittery and maybe a little bit more anxious. And so the next day he switched his breakfast, and now he eats more like eggs and avocado and greens for breakfast with no glucose spike. He doesn't have that anymore. So that's just an example of like okay, that's freedom. That's knowing what works for you and what doesn't, and not having to really think about it again, which is a gift, to just not have to question and wonder and this and that. And then I think the other thing is, like, in terms of just our personal identity, I mean, I think that sometimes we think of ourselves as like, oh, we're just an anxious person, or like we are just someone who like is always a little bit tired. Like, I'm just tired all the time. And you don't really know why. And there's a million wellness things to choose from. But having this data that's like, okay, actually, you're feeling anxious when you crash after a glucose spike. That's when you feel anxious. It takes it away from like, this is who I am, to like, this may be related to a choice that I'm making that I have the agency to change or to modify. I have the tools to sort of adjust that. And that can be really liberating. Like, okay, this is not just who I am. This is something, an interaction between my environment and my body that I have some control over. And you can move out of that sort of like, that strongly held sort of identity belief to, I have some ability to modulate this. And I think that is powerful, and that can actually extend to other parts of our lives in a positive way.
It's like when you know you're part of the problem, and take away the judgment around that, right? Like, it's not a blame situation. It's not anything else. It's like, but when you know you're part of the problem, that's actually a beautiful thing, because that means you can impact and have residency on the solution. When you're part of the problem in any aspect of your life, if there's somebody that is pissing you off and you have a relationship with them, friend, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, husband, wife, when you can see how you are a part of it, that doesn't mean that you caused it. That doesn't mean it's all on you. You can see your own part in it. Then that's a reminder that you can do something about it. If it's 100% somebody else's or something else's fault, you're not in control. You're not in control, and you can't do anything about it either. And that's nowhere more true than when it comes to a lot of the chronic diseases or just daily symptoms / things that we all go through, like energy slumps or the feeling of being anxious. Are you an anxious person, or have you just not made the connection yet of how your dietary and lifestyle choices are creating this, hypoglycemia?
After the crash is the hypoglycemia. Exactly.
And are basically, we've had some people on the podcast talking about it, and there was a reason for that. Because if you were out in the woods, in the forest, in nature, in the village, and we are at a place where we crash our blood sugar, our body wants us to get anxious, because it's like, you need to be alert. You need to go find food. You need to be aware. You could be at risk, because if you continue to crash further, then that's a whole bunch of other challenges. It's just in our modern world, we're not living out on the Sahara or in the woods or, in the rainforest. And we're the ones that are spiking and crashing our blood sugar. So our body, it doesn't know. It's still trying to act as if we're living on the plains of Africa or wherever we ended up coming from. And it's just trying to do its job and have us survive. It's just that we got to give it better inputs.
Absolutely. I love that. I think it's something we always have to remember. The body is here to help us. And every symptom we have, and this is really a functional medicine tenet, symptoms are a sign from the body that something is going on, that conditions need to be adjusted a little bit. So how can we really be curious about symptoms and try and understand what they are trying to tell us? That precept has changed my life, certainly, and my practice. Almost thanking the symptom and really trying to explore it with curiosity. So if that symptom is like fatigue in the morning or, anxiety or whatnot, the beauty of some of these tools, and I think other wearables too, like, Whoop or Aura or Fitbit, is that they can help you unpack some of that and understand maybe what some of the symptoms are telling you. Like, is it the blood sugar? Is it that my heart rate variability is just super low today? And so when we can link a choice with objective data, with a subjective sense of, or a symptom or a subjective feeling, that trifecta, I just feel like, is the root of personal empowerment, of behavior change, of getting out of that kind of like, victim mindset. And I think that's what you're kind of talking about. When we understand our role in things, we then have some control. And it's not like it's a mystery of how to fix it. We know how to improve our heart rate variability. We know what techniques can help us manage our blood sugar. So it's not like we're up a creek without a paddle. There's then ways to modulate it and really take that ownership. And so So that's where I feel like wearables can kind of help us in that deeper sense of finding that personal agency and empowerment to actually get closer to our goals in a more efficient way.
Let's go on to the next one. And before we do, I just want to rank this as, mostly this is people in the optimal category. We know that we were chit-chatting a little bit before we started recording. The biggest things largely on a population level that are going to be driving, glucose spikes and leading to like diabetes and in populations all around the world. You have Mexico, India, Saudi Arabia as being one of the fastest growing rates of like diabetes. And largely what you see in America and these global communities where we've exported our sort of processed food diet is the biggest things that tend to spike glucose and then lead to this insulin resistance is sodas and high fructose forms of calorie in liquid form, where you're getting a lot more concentrated version with no fibers, with nothing. So, if somebody's listening to these and we're going through and we're talking about grapes and oatmeal and sushi, just know, the people that we're scoring on here are not typically drinking soda every single day, but soda would be probably number one. Would you say if it was a global population?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's a very good caveat to this list. First of all, this list is the 5 surprising things.
Right, exactly.
There's 5 more on the list that are the less surprising things, which is like Chick-fil-A, McDonald's, donuts, cake. It's all the things. Those were kind of clear. And I would say that given the 10,000 people in our beta program who are paying money to use a continuous glucose monitor, probably not a lot of them are drinking soda. I actually haven't seen soda on our aggregate logs very frequently. And so, but I agree. I think that is the number one thing that we could do just globally to improve metabolic health is learn about how soda is affecting our bodies so that we can make better choices around it. I mean, you walk into the grocery store, any convenience store in the country, any airport, anything that's selling food, and there's soda everywhere. You could kind of get the impression like, oh, I mean, it's everywhere, so it's okay to drink. It's also, many of the ingredients in there are subsidized by our government, the corn syrup, et cetera. So you could almost get this impression of like, well, it's probably fine because it's everywhere and whatever, but it's not. I mean, it's the number one contributor to our poor metabolic health, I would say. Fructose has just this very interesting effect on the body where evolutionarily, fructose was meant to help you store fat, essentially. If you think about a hibernating animal, they are going, like a bear is going around and trying to find as much berries as it can. Fruits are rich in fructose to eat before it hibernates for months. And the signal to the body when you eat that fructose is store fat because we need to use this later. So you're drinking a soda, the same thing's happening to you, except you're eating orders of magnitude more of concentrated fructose without the fiber, like you said. What fructose does to the body is it gives a signal to the liver to actually become fat. So fatty liver, it's called de novo lipogenesis. Lipogenesis is genesis of fat. And that fat in the liver, even small amounts of fat in the liver, create what's called liver insulin resistance, hepatic insulin resistance. And the liver is really the core of our metabolism in the body, and fructose is just directly impairing its ability to be insulin sensitive. So liquid calories, liquid fructose, just really a major, major driver of so much of the morbidity that we're seeing in the country.
And the wellness version of that is still things like fruit juice, right? People drinking a lot of fruit juice and having it as a regular part of their diet. The juicing trend was fantastic. And obviously, we have a juice in front of us here. This company, Farmers Juice, was nice enough to send it. No affiliation with it. But what was cool about it is that I think they had sent it to some of the people on your team at Levels, and they had tried it and they drank the green juice, and it didn't have like a big spike on their blood sugar. Like that's the ideal juice to have. But when we get into these fruit juices as a regular consumption of our diet, that's when even people who think that they're eating healthy could still see that I'm eating healthy and like I want to get rid of a little bit of this belly fat. Like why? Or my energy dips later on the day. Why is it still happening? Well, pay attention to this fruit juice, fructose that it comes, especially in the liquid forms in your diet.
Absolutely. I drank a drink recently as an experiment called Immunity Fix, and it was like a $10, juice bar drink. And it did have certain components in it that are associated with improved immunity. So it had like ginger and it had turmeric and things like that. So that's great. That's true. Those impact our immune function. But it was also just a ton of liquid fruit. And my glucose went up 85 points. I mean, it was just like giant mountain, giant crash. It's pretty well established that glucose spikes can impair immunity almost immediately. I mean, long-term metabolic dysfunction and having prediabetes or diabetes has a significant impact on our immunity. High blood sugar actually like stunts our abilities, immune cells to move. The process of chemotaxis, which is immune cells moving towards their target, is stunted by high sugar. It also creates inflammation in the body, which impairs our immune function. And so there's no question that for me, my reaction to this juice, based on what I saw in my continuous glucose monitor, is hurting my immunity. There's no question in my mind. And yet that's what the label said. It said immunity fix. And so, yeah, it's like there's the best intentions with drinking these things. But if you don't know, and I certainly felt a little off after drinking it when I had my crash, but could have probably chalked that up to anything like, oh, it's a stressful day, But it was the drink. And so I'm not going to drink that in the future. And drinking something more like a smoothie, like, back to, Kelly LeVeque, she's got this fabulous smoothie that's like minimal fruit, the Fab Four, low fruit, high fiber, high protein, high healthy fat. They don't spike me even 10 points. And so, but how would I know that, without testing? And so, it's been an interesting learning experience, kind of figuring out how to eat fruit in a way that's going to support my goals.
Absolutely. Because there's a lot of beautiful things about fruit too, right?
Yeah.
We just had Dr. William Lee on the podcast. He's really big on sort of highlighting the different polyphenol compounds and pomegranates and other things that support the gut microbiome and modulate gut bacteria and do a whole bunch of things that we don't even fully understand yet. Yeah. And so we want to be able to incorporate them, but we don't necessarily want to have them in large concentrations of fruit as juice as a big part of our diet. That's when they can become problematic. But eating them and then eating them in the pairing, because, food pairing is one of your central ways of how to make these better, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a list of surprising, and we're about to get to number 3, but it's also how you can eat these things still and make them work for you in a way that they don't spike them. So one way one takeaway is you might just have a little less. You might have less. So if you're a big fan of something and you want to have it, you like grapes, you might just have a few grapes instead of just sitting down and eating a bag of grapes, right? Just for the taste of it. Another way is the pairing, as you mentioned earlier. You might have it with, and let's just put a button on that. First, would you say fat and then protein, or would you put those in equal categories in terms of what people should consider to pair a food with to have it not have as big of a glucose response in the body? Yeah.
Well, the ones that have been well studied are fat, protein, and fiber. I would probably put fat and fiber as the top things to pair it with. So for me, an optimal way to eat fruit is with a chia seed pudding, because chia seeds have a huge, huge amount of fiber. And fiber actually blocks our ability to even take in some of that, digest some of that glucose. It's like giving you freebie, points essentially in the gut. And so, like a chia pudding with some fruit and a little bit of nuts or nut butter, to me, that's kind of that optimal fat and fiber mix. And about with
for
fruit.
Like a serving for you in the morning, if you would have that in the morning, let's say you wanted that, how much nut butter are you putting inside there?
Like a tablespoon, and maybe like a quarter cup of blueberries or other berries, and then maybe a cup or so of this like chia pudding made with an unsweetened nut milk of some sort that I've like let go in the fridge overnight, and so I think the thing about protein that's interesting is that protein can actually trigger insulin a little bit. Glucose is the primary trigger of insulin, but protein actually can also trigger some insulin, and excess protein in the body can be converted to glucose in the liver. So going super, super gung-ho on protein, it's just something to be kind of nuanced about. The greatest effect for that is actually from dairy protein. Casein will actually have that insulin stimulating effect. So protein from plants is going to do that a little bit less. But that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind. Whereas fat is going to have very, very little impact on your insulin, similar with fiber as well.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, when we're talking about fats, Give us the breakdown. What are the best fats to eat?
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to like food as molecular information, like you want to get the best fat molecular information in your body. So I think the top ones I would talk about would be like omega-3s. These are fats that we know are anti-inflammatory and really important for building our cell membranes and having this like nice fluidity of our cell membranes. Every single one of the 30 trillion cells in our body is wrapped in fat. And so we want that healthy fluid fat. And so that's where omega-3s can really come in handy. So that's going to be from things like chia seeds, flax seeds, and then like the smash fish. So the sardines, mackerel, anchovies, salmon, herring, and that's where you can really get a lot of those healthy fats. And then I, really just focus on whole foods fats as much as we can. So things that are coming from nuts and seeds, things like avocado, olives, and coconut. These are going to be fats that are wrapped up in all the other beautiful things that these plants have. Like a single nut is going to have probably well over 1,000 phytochemicals and other, nutrients in it that are wrapped up around that fat. So that unrefined whole food version, nut, seed, avocado, coconut, olives, etc. That's really where I focus my energy. And then if you are going to be eating more of the refined fats, so things like oils, you want to focus on the ones that are going to be least readily oxidized. So people have probably heard quite a bit about oxidative stress and sort of this idea of free radicals, whereby molecules can essentially become reactive and go into the body and cause damage. They have these unpaired electrons that are going around trying to bind with things. And when they do that with your proteins, your cell membranes, your DNA, it causes issues. And so certain fats can become easily oxidized. And that's going to be those refined seed oils like the soybean, safflower, corn, canola, things like that. Those are going to become easily oxidized. I would, of course, I'm sure this has been talked about on the podcast before, but like throw out any of the refined seed oils, which are known to be sort of pro-oxidant, and stick with the ones that are less likely to be oxidized. So that's going to be things like coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil, eaten more at room temperature. So big picture, omega-3s coming from the sources that we talked about, the whole food fats coming from plants. And then if you're going to eat the refined fats, eat the ones that are least likely to be oxidized, which is like the avocado, olive oil, and coconut oil.
Yeah. It seems like the fruit fats, right?
Yeah.
Avocado, right, is a fruit. Olive is a fruit. And coconut, I guess, is kind of it's a nut, a fruit nut, something like that. And the ones we want to stay away from are these vegetable fats that are really not even, pressed vegetables. They're 10 to 28 step process of milking oil out of something like corn. And if you care about how, if anybody's like, okay, it sounds like very nuanced. Is really, do I have to really worry that much about soybean oil and safflower oil and all those different, vegetable oils? If you care about how you look and aging, like these oils will age you, right? So
they
vanities,
rust you.
They rust you.
Yeah.
They age you. So if you want to look old and wrinkly, and obviously old is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just using the context of what I'm talking about here. Prematurely, if you want to prematurely age, eat those oils, right? If you don't want to prematurely age, stay away from those oils, and the foods that they're often in is the primary way that most people are consuming them.
Absolutely. I think it is that simple, actually. Like, we have to avoid these oils, and it is incredible. They are in everything. I mean, when you walk into even Whole Foods, go pick up a packaged food item and try to find a packaged food that does not have a refined vegetable oil in it. It is so challenging. So you really have to kind of be vigilant about it. And the easiest way to avoid it is to eat whole foods, to eat real, clean, whole foods and prepare them yourself. But yeah, it's landmines out there when it comes to refined vegetable oils. But I think we're going to be talking about those in 10, 20 years, like we talk about cigarettes. Like we know they're causing damage to our cellular biology.
Number 3, sushi. Tell us why sushi was one of the items that scored very low, which means that it had a big impact on our blood sugar, which leads to these roller coasters, which leads to, in the short term, increased belly fat, lack of focus, crashes. In the long term can lead to a whole host of other chronic diseases that we mentioned earlier. So why sushi?
I think sushi probably was one of our low scorers is for a couple of reasons. One, rice is just spikes a lot of people. Like white rice tends to be a really big spiker, and we see that amongst a lot of our members. I personally, rice in any context gets me 40, 50 points above my baseline. So I have to be very judicious with when I'm eating rice. And now I'm a huge fan of alternatives like cauliflower rice or broccoli rice. The other thing is that with sushi, a lot of times sushi rice is sweetened and may have some sugar and vinegar and other stuff in there to make it taste good. So that's something to just maybe ask about when you go to certain restaurants.
Yeah, there's one right down the street that all my friends used to love to go to. It's called Sugarfish, right? It's a great place, shout out to them. But yes, the rice is sweetened, which is why people love it.
Absolutely, yeah. And so that's something to think about. I think it's fun to learn. And the other thing is, so fish is going to have a bit of fat and a bit of protein, but I would say the ratio of like rice to fish is often pretty low. There's a lot of rice, not a lot of fish. So there's so many alternatives that you can do though. Like one thing is make sure you're starting your sushi dinner with some non-carby foods. We know that like food sequencing, adding, for instance, vegetables or protein before we eat the carbohydrates can really be very helpful in blunting our response. So there's actually been studies where they've given people chicken and vegetables before like a pasta dish or a bread dish, and they have a much lower glucose response than if they eat the bready, pasty dish before the chicken and vegetables. So just swap out the timing. So that might mean getting a seaweed salad, getting some edamame, which is going to have fat, protein, before you get your rice.
Where typically at a lot of restaurants, they might be serving the bread first.
Or the tortilla chips.
Exactly. And just hold off on that and actually first go for a salad, maybe some protein inside of that, some fats, as you mentioned.
Guacamole with vegetables. Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly.
And most restaurants will do that for you, right? They have the vegetables there. So I love when my family, we go to Mexican restaurants, we will ask for just like, can we get the guacamole and just some cut vegetables?
Totally.
Start with that first. And then, sure, we might have some corn tortillas or whatever later on, but I have seen a difference in my glucose response when we do that.
Yeah. So that's something I think you can do at sushi restaurants. Also, like lean into sashimi, just getting like the fish maybe without the rice underneath it and really appreciating that flavor of the fish without all the carbs. And maybe just stick to a smaller amount of actual sushi with rice. I've also become a huge fan of cauliflower rice sushi, which I will probably get some people totally rolling their eyes listening to this, but it's totally worth trying. I make sushi at home and I take a bag of frozen organic cauliflower rice. It's $2.99 at Whole Foods. Microwave the rice in a glass bowl or whatever, then add some tahini, and that makes it kind of sticky. And, you just roll it out just like you would do rice for sushi, and you cannot tell the difference. And that is going to have zero glucose response. I've eaten tons of cauliflower rice sushi. I post this on my, social media, and there's just really no response compared to maybe a 50, 60, 70 point response with regular sushi. And it then also just becomes a conduit for putting more vegetables and avocado inside the sushi. So that's a really healthy meal. And to me, I'm like, hey, I get to eat a lot more if I'm eating it this way. And so it's kind of a fun hack for sushi that I've been a big fan of.
I love the taste of cauliflower rice. I will have to say, and I'm just still dialing this in, I get so bloated when I have raw cauliflower. So I think that's just, I did so much damage to my gut microbiome growing up. I had chronic ear infections. I had all sorts of issues, and I was just on antibiotics, right? Back in the day, everybody would just pop pills, especially when you have doctors in the family. They'll say, just come, we'll give you an antibiotic and whatever. So I think I just decimated my gut bacteria. It took me years to build it back up, but there's still certain foods that cause a reaction. Again, individuality. You do great with it. I kind of get a little bit of, well, not a little bit, I get a lot of bloating with it. So cooked cauliflower I love. I've tried because I saw it on your Instagram and I was like, you know what? I haven't had cauliflower rice in such a long time. We've been having this bag from Whole Foods again that's just been sitting in our freezer. Let's try it. And I just was bloated all night.
Oh
but,
gosh.
It's a good thing for people to try if they can handle it.
Yeah. Biochemical individuality. It's each thing, you got to try these things. And I think eventually when this sort of more real-time stool microbiome testing comes along, which I know there's lots of companies working on this, like it's going to be interesting to see if we can like test and figure out like what foods work for us from that perspective as well. So
the other thing you guys were mentioning about sushi, just a small little hack for people, is often the soy sauce will have sugar inside of it. So, if you buy like a wheat-free tamari, especially there's some soy sauce sort of healthier alternatives, liquid aminos.
Yeah.
A lot of my friends will just bring that with them to the sushi restaurant and just have it there and just pour it in their, little side dish where you put the soy sauce in. So that's another little hack. All right, this is a big one because I feel like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, you really started to see this peak, which is the acai bowl. Acai was the superfood, was one of the top superfoods of, the 2000s. You would see it everywhere in all different cafes and other stuff and getting on that trend, and it's all over Whole Foods and stuff. So talk to us about acai and what you guys noticed about that.
This one was probably the most shocking to me because this was in our top 20, or actually this was in our top 40 worst scoring logs. And this is universally, I think, thought of as like one of the healthiest things you could have. And people are paying a lot of money for these acai bowls. And we had, I think well over 100 people log these in their logs. And it was a zone score of 5, which is essentially like a big, big spike. I think what's going on here, acai itself is actually not a food with a lot of carbohydrates. It's more of a high fat food. I think it's the things that people are adding to this. And so this is kind of going to be one of those situations where potentially you're adding tons of fruit to this bowl. You're adding tropical fruits, which tend to be high in sugar. So things like mangoes. Yeah, exactly. Like a lot of berries, oranges, kiwis, things like that. Papaya, and not really getting a lot of fat and protein in there. So it's basically, other than the acai, which has some fat, a little bit of a naked carbohydrate bomb. So if I were going to do, and I think it's also possible that people are adding sweetened nut milks to these things when you're like actually blending the acai. What I've found is that most coffee shops and juice bars are not using unsweetened nut milks. And so I'd probably favor making one of these at home, making the base really be more of like a green smoothie. So like spinach, kale, unsweetened nut milk, acai, maybe some fruit, some low glycemic fruit, build the base of the acai bowl, and then use just a little bit of fruit on top, maybe the fruits that for you don't spike as much. So for me, that's going to be things like oranges, blueberries, raspberries, cherries, and then add the fat and protein. So like get the walnuts, the hemp seeds, the chia seeds, the coconut on top, and just make sure it's a little bit more balanced. So it's really kind of, I think for this one, about shifting the ratios of what you're eating, because there's a lot of goodness in there. But I think when it can just become too sweet forward and too sort of tropical fruit forward, that's when we get into the big spikes.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, most people are not making these super acai bowls at home. That's probably one of their delights, is to go out on a Sunday morning, brunch, whatever. We're here in Santa Monica. You could probably find at least 30, 40 restaurants that make some version of an acai bowl within a mile of where we are in the studio over here. So it's being aware that when you go out, that there's not somebody necessarily looking with a lens to see the total amount of sugar that's going to be coming in. And some of these acai bowls, when you look at them, friends who have eaten them out, it's almost as comparable as a soda. So that's the part to really be aware, is that molecularly your body's responding like you had soda. Sure, you're getting some of the polyphenols, you're getting some, other things inside of there too, but your body's responding on the glucose side as if you just drank a soda.
Yeah. And there's definitely some restaurants that are like, using this framework to create, I think about like down the street Cafe Gratitude, restaurants that are really like very transparent about we're using unsweetened nut milk, we're using healthy organic fats, et cetera. And so, kudos to those companies they're doing that. But it is interesting, people who might be eating these things and again thinking that it's serving whatever their goal or their pain point is. Like there might be women who, for instance, like going back to polycystic ovarian syndrome, like this is the leading cause of infertility in the United States. It's potentially up to 20% of American women are suffering from this. It's fundamentally a metabolic disease where high insulin levels are stimulating our ovaries to make more testosterone. You can imagine who is the demographic who's like eating a lot of these bowls. It's like the young women, childbearing age, and might be going out and being like, this is the healthiest. I'm not getting pancakes. I'm not getting waffles. I'm getting an acai bowl. But through the lens of what we know about what's actually causing an issue like PCOS, that very well could not be sort of contributing to that goal of easing that. Because it is gonna, that if you're having a spike that big, it's gonna produce the more insulin, which is gonna kind of feed into the pathology. So I think
it's really all part of like the sophistication of wellness. And what it reminds me of a little bit is that, my background is from, my ancestry is from India, and Indians in America, it's a very interesting group to study. And we've had some people on the podcast talking about it. They typically actually are very highly educated, right? The ones that made it out here to America, they tend to be the people that were able to leave and they got here on H-1B visas and other things like that. So they're engineers or doctors or other stuff. Not all Indians are doctors when you go to India and other places, right? So it's not that every Indian is smart. It's just the ones that made it out here tend to be from a particular population. There's a huge percentage of vegetarians, right? That are part of that group in the South Asian population as a whole. And they also have one of the highest incomes. They have the highest income on average for any subset population that's inside of the United States. Why I bring all those things up is that they also suffer from the highest risk of cardiovascular health. So you see a population that is vegetarian, right? But doing it in a way that is eating anything but meat. So they tend to have a lot of, especially the region that I'm from, Gujarat, the South Asians here in America, they tend to have a lot of sugar in their foods. There's a lot of sugar. They eat a lot of fried foods, so that's a lot of vegetable oils. They're not eating actually a lot of vegetables. Even though they're vegetarian, there's very little fresh vegetables that are part of the diet. They tend to be eating more processed carbohydrates. So you see now, and why I wanted to create that parallel is that that's very similar to the sort of young female who is wellness forward that made up a lot of the early wellness movement, who was probably a little bit had access to, had education, had access to some disposable income, and is trying to make the right choices for them. So you can see how two completely groups are thinking that they're doing their best, but because they're not looking at some of the baseline markers that are there, they actually could be suffering, one group from major infertility, another group could be suffering with, heart disease, and not understanding that insulin resistance is the biggest driver for both of them.
Absolutely. I think about my age group, and some things that I was thinking about in my 20s, like things like acne, or, you're buying creams for wrinkles, or you're thinking about, work is stressful, anxiety, things like this. When you start to look through the lens of how so many of these things can be related to metabolic dysfunction, it's actually very liberating, because you think, oh, okay, as opposed to going to, the dermatologist for this or whatever, and, the OBGYN for this, like you obviously need to see those doctors and like be in touch, but knowing that actually the trunk of the tree of many of these conditions is the same thing, and that you can modulate that through diet and lifestyle, it's very empowering. It's like, this is the foundation of systems and network biology. Understand how conditions and symptoms are linked and then treat at that level, as opposed to seeing all of them as isolated silos and then playing whack-a-mole with, different things like antibiotic for the acne and retinol cream for the wrinkles and this and that. Just to get really specific here, insulin and insulin-like growth factor, which are released in response to carbohydrates, glucose in the diet, those actually directly, talking about acne here, go to the hair follicle and tell the sebaceous gland, which is the oil-producing gland of the hair follicle, to produce more oil. It's a growth signal. Insulin is like a pro-growth signal, which is why it makes us overweight and store fat. It also tells growth signals to other things like the oil-producing gland of the hair follicle. So when you just take away that signal through reducing, the refined carbohydrates, reducing the insulin signal, your skin produces less of this oil from the sebaceous gland and acne clears up. That's been shown in many, many studies that over 12 weeks, you can reduce acne just by going on a healthy, lower carbohydrate diet. Similar thing is true of PCOS. The insulin is stimulating the ovaries to make these male hormones. And there's been a number of studies showing that healthy ketogenic diets can actually reduce or reverse PCOS in as little as 12 weeks. That was a study actually that came out last year. And what I loved about this particular study is it wasn't just a low carb, super low carb, like processed diet. It was a healthy Mediterranean low carb diet filled with vegetables and polyphenols. And it was actually very low on like meat and animal protein. It was much more based on greens and healthy fats and whatnot. And then similar is true of anxiety. Studies have shown that those swings of up and down glucose can lead to anxiety. And so by actually going on a low glycemic diet, they've been shown that you can actually reduce generalized anxiety disorder symptoms. So the hope of drawing this sort of like picture of how all these things are related from potentially root cause perspective, and not saying that it's like glucose and carbohydrates are the thing that are causing all these conditions. It's one of the many factors that can create conditions in the body to lead to these things. But that to me is just like empowering to know that and that we have control over that. But you're not going to get that information from your OBGYN, from your dermatologist, from your mental health provider. That's not what we're taught. We're not taught about nutrition. We're not taught about how to think of things on a root cause perspective. We're really not taught a systems biology framework to health in modern American, medical training. We're thought to think of things as separate silos. And so one of my hopes with these wearables and products like, CGM for wellness purposes and what we're doing at Levels is that when people start to see things this way, they will actually ask more of their doctors. Like, hey, I've been reading about all this stuff. I've been thinking about all this stuff. Like, can we talk about it from this framework? And again, just like with sort of the grassroots movement in the food industry of people asking for more because they have their data, I think the same is going to be true of what we do with doctors. We ask that we have this information now that we can go to them and say, hey, I've been reading about the links between all these conditions and blood sugar. Here's my data. Can we talk about this in a real way? And that it might push doctors to seek out more education on this stuff and talk to their patients about it.
What was that light bulb moment for you, right? You're a medical doctor. You were going through your training. We did talk a little bit about your origin story in the last podcast, but what was that light bulb moment for you that it's not all these individual silos. It's not acne is over here and PCOS is over here and they have nothing to do with each other. When did that moment click for you that they're all connected and you became, because you're an ENT, right? And so when did you become sort of a super generalist that understood that a lot of these things are linked together through these core systems in the body?
Yeah. So I did 5 years of training in ear, nose, and throat, head and neck surgery. And then I actually left completely. I left the field because I did have some of these, realizations and realized, okay, I don't want to be operating on people such a morbid procedure until I really figure out whether there's more from a root cause perspective we could be doing to help people. And a lot of it came down to sort of stepping back and looking at what I was doing every day. And we talked about this a little in our first podcast, but so much of the conditions I was treating were inflammatory conditions. It was like the sinusitis, thyroiditis, laryngitis, and itis that means inflammation in medicine. Prescribing so many steroids to quell the immune system to treat these conditions. And then when steroids and antibiotics didn't work, you take people to the operating room. And just realizing that doing a surgery doesn't change underlying upregulation of the immune system. That can only be done by addressing whatever threat the body is sensing that's creating an immune response. So I was really trying to identify what is that threat. But the light bulb moment for me was looking at all these ENT conditions and the real molecular biology of them. What's happening in the tissue, in the sinuses that makes them inflamed? Well, a lot of it is upregulation of immune cytokines. So things like TNF alpha interferon gamma, IL-6. These are chemicals that immune cells are secreting and other cells are secreting to essentially create an immune response. And then when you look at all these other huge killers of Americans in the United States, like sinusitis is not on the top 10 leading causes of death for Americans. It's not even close. It doesn't kill people. But the ones that are killing Americans, which is like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, dementia, all the same cytokines. It's the IL-6, it's the TNF alpha. And then saying, okay, so this is really talking again about systems biology. These sort of common cytokines, this Venn diagram between all these different conditions, I sort of step back and say, why aren't we treating at that level? Why aren't we thinking about what's triggering these? Because if we could bring that down, and, of course, there's all these drugs that are being created to block these immune mediators. But then you start researching a little bit more. There's a lot related to our food and our exposures and our stress that also stimulate these things. So wouldn't it make sense that we would talk to patients about that and like how to actually, minimize these things? Something that was fascinating about the COVID epidemic, and I actually wrote about this in April of last year. I published a paper in the journal Metabolism about the relationship between blood sugar and COVID. One of the things that high blood sugar does is promote these inflammatory cytokines that I'm talking about. And those were associated with worse COVID mortality because what we learned early on was that it wasn't the virus that's killing people in COVID. It's the immune response to the virus. So if you're in an already baseline inflammatory, upregulated state, and then you have the virus come on board, which is also triggering the immune system, that just is this synergistic, huge immune response that can cause the end organ damage, the lung problems, et cetera, that ultimately cause mortality. So if you're baseline obese, diabetic, have sinusitis, all these things, your immune system's already revved up. That's obviously going to be a much bigger response when you get the virus. And so, so it just, that was kind of the light bulb moment for me, is like, let's look at this Venn diagram of everything that's going on and then treat at that level in the middle. And that's really what systems and network biology is. It's moving away from the reactive, silo-based sort of symptom management of medicine to let's talk about cell biology. Let's talk about how our lifestyle and our diet is affecting cell biology and work towards creating conditions in the body that essentially help our cells thrive, because when our cells work, our tissues work. When our tissues work, our organs work. And when our organs work, we don't have symptoms. So it's
a fundamental shift in how we approach medicine and even just healthy living. We're spending billions of dollars on these drugs, again, well-intentioned for, let's just take, for instance, Alzheimer's, right? We're spending billions of dollars looking for that one thing that is going to make a difference for patients with Alzheimer's and maybe even slow the decline. So far, there's not really anything that's working great. In fact, a lot of the drugs are actually making things worse. And we have to understand that it's not just one thing. These systems are all communicating together. Alzheimer's isn't just about the brain. It's also about the gut and our inflammatory pathways and the whole bunch of other things, including insulin resistance. So that it's a different framework of thinking. It's been a little slow to, percolate and get out there to the medical community, but that's all things in life. It's slow in the beginning, but there are a group of people and companies that are trying to leapfrog with technology. They often talk about, one of the big concerns in Africa originally. I was born in Kenya, and I remember discussions of how do we get telephone wire and internet and everything else like that, because it seems to be, from what we know, that when people have access to these communications, then commerce happens more, education happens more, and there just wasn't the infrastructure. And then mobile phones came, and that whole leapfrog, the whole aspect of needing to put telephone wires up and down Africa and through all these different countries. And now through things like satellite internet, we don't have to worry about cable, so more kids can get educated. People that don't have a school in their area can do that. In that same way, we're sort of leapfrogging a little bit, right? We're very thankful for the medicine that's here in the United States, but it's also the most expensive medicine in the world, and it's not necessarily leading to better outcomes for us. In fact, a lot of people here are sicker than other parts of the world that are there. So when you can get things like continuous glucose monitors, and you can have that directly to empower that information, you're dealing in the category of subclinical. You go for your yearly physical, and so many people have had this issue. You don't have a disease, right? Knock on wood, you don't have cancer yet. You don't have Alzheimer's. You're not diabetic yet, but you don't feel great. You might have a little bit of extra belly fat. Your sleep is off. You feel like you're not functioning the same way that you're doing it. And your friends and your family tell you it's just aging. Your gut microbiome and your intestinal tract, you might feel bloated more often. And you just chalk it up to that. And your doctor pats you on the back and says, hey, you're looking good. I'll see you next year. Maybe at most they'll tell you to lose a little weight and exercise a little bit more. And if you're smoking, tell you to stop smoking. But now we can look at all these other things between, hey, I have full-blown cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, and I have nothing. There's a whole vast array in the middle, which is all about optimization, which is why I'm really excited about what you guys are doing. You're really empowering people to take back control of their health, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, this is, I think Mark Hyman talks about the FLC syndrome, which is the feel like crap, which I think is exactly what you're talking about. It's sort of that in between. And when everyone feels like crap, we can start to think that it's like normal. Like this is just part of living in the modern world, but it's not normal. Like we all can feel amazing. We all can feel great, but we do have to really take ownership of our health. Like the systems, unfortunately, are going to be slow to change, whether that's the food system, the agricultural system, the healthcare system. And so in that space, and I do think really positive forces are at play to move these industries in the right direction. But in that space, that's where we need to kind of really take ownership and make these choices. I mean, ultimately, our health is a function of our choices. Like health does not come from a pill. It doesn't come from a surgery. It does not come from the doctor's office. It comes from the thousands of micro decisions we make every day, week, year. And so, my passion, and I think so many people in the wellness industry now, is how do you help people make those choices in a way that's going to serve them, make them feel empowered, and be able to create those conditions in the body that ultimately make us not feel FLC, feel like crap. So,
it's so true. I was listening to my friend, Dr. Rangan Chatterjee's podcast recently, and he had a gentleman on, I think his name was Gregory McCown. I've quoted him a few times on my recent episodes, and he had a great quote, and it said, if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will, right? Sometimes people who tend to be in the wellness world or other things, it can be chalked up to a grand conspiracy to try to control us with these processed foods, other stuff. When you study human nature and history, you realize that most of what's going on is well-intentioned people working at corporations trying to do their best with the knowledge and information that they have, right? They themselves don't know about how to, create health for themselves or for the people that they're serving. So a lot of the state of the world that we're in, it's the system has gotten out of control because it was never designed intentionally. It was never designed intentionally to create, health. And so it's gotten out of control. So if you can step in and prioritize it with your own design, what do you want to design for your own life? What do you want to prioritize? It's design-based thinking, but for yourself. And when you step into that, you become a CEO of your own health. And a CEO of your own health, it can listen to people, it can weigh options, but ultimately it's making the decisions. Because if you don't make those decisions for you, somebody else is going to make those decisions upstream, and you're just going to have to suffer with the consequences. We still have a few more to get to over here. We have one more on the list of 5 surprising foods, but I don't want to make it all. There's a lot of good news inside of what we covered, but I also want to touch on, you sent me a list of some of the foods that were what we call level 10 scoring foods or meals. And I want to chat about that a little bit to kind of give people hope about what really happens when you dial in your food. So let's talk about the last one on the list of 5 surprising blood sugar spikers. And that was Thai food, pho, ramen. And tell us why those foods scored so low.
So we lumped these all together, Thai food, pho, ramen, Chinese food, because they have a lot of commonalities. And one of the big ones is noodles. All of those things are going to include some sort of rice or wheat-based noodle, which is essentially an ultra-refined version of a carbohydrate. And these just send people through the, to the moon with glucose. And so I think what's so neat about a lot of these, I mean, you may love the flavors, and it doesn't mean you can never eat these types of foods. It just means being a little more thoughtful when you're looking at the menu. So maybe it's moving away from the pad thai, which is going to be like a ton of noodles and maybe a sweet sauce, to actually asking like, hey, do you have a curry that's like pretty minimally sweetened? And then just eating that by itself with some good protein in there, whether it's tofu or fish or chicken or whatever. Maybe avoiding the rice or just having a tiny bit of rice with an unsweetened curry. But ultimately, if the base of the meal, like a pho or a ramen or a noodle dish or a lo mein, is noodles, like it's gonna just be, that's like a naked carb. It's just so much turned straight into sugar in the bloodstream.
And there's some great alternatives coming. Like, have you tried Miracle Noodles or like those kelp noodles?
There's so many good ones. There's kelp noodles, there's Miracle Noodles, there's shirataki noodles, which are made of konjac root, which is a super high fiber food. Everyone in our company has tested konjac root noodles. The brands are shirataki noodles and then NU pasta. Virtually zero glucose spike, and it looks identical to any other type of noodle or pasta, but it's made from a super high fiber root, basically.
It actually has one of the longest chain fibers out of any root that's there, and so you get this. I mean, it's so powerful that a lot of companies have actually turned it into like a supplement and stuff. There's one that's out there called PGX that a lot of people use, and it's an incredible fiber source for people.
It is amazing. So I'm going through a lot of NU pasta these days because I'm using it like if I'm making pesto. I love zucchini noodles too, but if I'm doing a pesto or if I'm making a soup at home or something like that, or even with a red sauce, like you can basically just swap it in. But there's also tofu noodles. You can often ask for tofu noodles at a ramen restaurant. And then of course, like zucchini noodles, yellow or green squash can work as well.
So I want to switch from this list of surprising foods to pivot to the 5 less surprising foods, and I want to share an experience that I had, and I think this goes back to bio-individuality and everything. But I would be curious to see if you've had any similar experiences from you or anybody in your community. So I don't eat a lot of pizza. Pizza is one of the foods that's listed on the 5 less surprising blood sugar bombs. But interestingly enough, there's a place here in LA that gets native wheat from Italy. It's called Pisana. It's in my neighborhood of Brentwood. And then they also, I think sometimes even bring cheese like mozzarella and stuff like that they use for some of their pizzas from Italy as well too. So it already doesn't have, it's better quality and things like that. And it's probably going to have more fiber. So I ordered a pizza from them thinking like I was going to expect this big spike. And since we were just talking about Thai food, Chinese pho, ramen, I had one time straight up rice noodles with a little bit of, the packet of whatever's included with the rice noodles, some seasoning. And then a few days later, I had this pizza. And I actually got a much bigger spike from the rice noodles than I did from the pizza. Now, the pizza was like a very simple Neapolitan with this native wheat, and I think it had some buffalo mozzarella. And I was really surprised. And it wasn't gluten-free, because previously, for years, I would do gluten-free. And then as I started wearing, this continuous glucose monitor, I knew that gluten-free would spike often. Most people have the realization that actually gluten-free spikes you way more, like gluten-free breads spike you way more than traditional non-gluten-free, like just wheat-based. And so it wasn't a gluten-free pizza, and I didn't have as much of a spike from that as I thought I would. Any thoughts on that about what was going on?
It's so interesting. And I mean, I would guess that some of it comes down to the wheat that's being grown that went into that flour in Europe. I mean, and then secondarily, I think the processing, the process of processing for that flour. Basically, in the United States, we have genetically modified wheat to have really high, gliadin concentration, which is essentially like one of the gluten proteins. That makes the bread stickier and makes it sort of taste better and fluffier when we're baking things. We've also, when we process it here, we are like stripping everything from the wheat. We're just really getting the like pure carbohydrate, non-fiber source there when we're making our white flour and then, bleaching it. And it's just basically essentially the equivalent of sugar. I can imagine this pizza probably was more of like a stone ground, like still had its hull of the more of the fiber part of the wheat, and probably was like you said, like a heritage wheat that was not genetically engineered or modified to kind of really concentrate the tasty stuff that's probably going to translate into a sugar spike, and just a lot more natural. So
and the pizza sauce, right? Because a lot of times
right.
people go out and get pizza sauce, and the pizza sauce here, is not a plug for the place, but they're just using regular. I mean, they're making homemade. It's not homemade, but it's not added sugar and other stuff. Kind of like Primal Kitchen's, tomato sauce and things like that. There's not sugar added to it, and it still tastes, fantastic.
Exactly. Tomato sauce, a lot of tomato products can really have all that hidden sugar. The average ketchup in the store has, between 3 and 7 grams of sugar per serving. It's incredible. And so, yeah, I think those are probably the reasons. But I mean, it's great to know that now if you're going to get your pizza in LA, like, where to get it,
Yeah, actually, for anybody that is in LA, like Italy also is one place that has native wheat, surprisingly, for some of their breads and other things like that. And you can get native wheat that's over there. And this spot. But, just another reason why I love the monitor, because you find these little surprises. You find these little surprises for you, and you're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I really thought that food was going to make me go bonkers. And that's also not to say, we should add in a caveat here, and you guys have written about this, sometimes certain alcohols don't register very high, meaning like they don't spike your blood sugar. But that doesn't mean that we're encouraging people to have alcohol all the time. There's other factors that are present inside of it. What are some other examples? If you could talk about alcohol, are there any other examples of foods that just because they don't have a blood sugar impact, we might still want to be wary of how much we consume them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this brings up a great point, which is that like glucose is one biomarker that can tell us what food is doing to our bodies, like a continuous glucose monitor. But the future needs to have a lot more biomarkers that tell us about how food is affecting our bodies. Like in this episode alone, we've talked about oxidative stress, for instance. Like you could drink a full glass of soybean oil and your glucose is not going to spike. Like it's going to be flat because that's straight fat. But over time, those highly oxidized oils are going to cause mitochondrial damage and problems that will essentially create issues with your metabolic machinery that down the road can lead to problems. So is that going to be picked up on the continuous glucose monitor? No. But down the road, potentially an oxidative stress type of monitor, something like that could be really interesting to sort of help deconvolute like all the different variables that foods are doing to us. Another thing would be like you could eat salmon, for instance, and you could eat sort of like farmed salmon or like wild Alaskan salmon. The farmed salmon is going to have more toxins in it and omega-6 fats, and the wild salmon is going to have more omega-3 fats and be kind of cleaner. Both of them might look like a perfect score on the glucose monitor because they don't really have any carbohydrates, but you're not going to have insight into some of that other stuff. So it's a huge step forward, continuous glucose monitoring, in terms of a wearable that gives us real-time insight into what our food's doing to our body, but it's certainly not the end-all be-all. And I think the future of sort of multi-analyte, more analytes that we can monitor to tell us how food is affecting our bodies is going to be really important. One of the biggest ones actually would also be fructose. So interestingly about fructose, straight fructose alone does not actually change your glucose levels. So if you just drink straight fructose, and I don't mean high fructose corn syrup, because high fructose corn syrup actually is about half and half fructose and glucose. So it's still going to cause a glucose rise. But if you just were to find straight fructose, it would not actually create a glucose or an insulin spike, which is kind of interesting because we know it's very bad for metabolic health. What it's doing is that it's actually telling the liver to create this fat in the liver, the de novo lipogenesis, which creates hepatic liver insulin resistance, which causes problems down the road with how you process any form of sugar, because you're basically generating insulin resistance, which is then going to make you process glucose poorly in the future. So to be able to actually have a sensor that could tell us what fructose is doing to our body could also be a really interesting thing. And there are biomarkers like uric acid and others that can tell us about fructose breakdown. So there are these things like alcohol, straight fructose, different quality sorts of fats and meats, oils, and that aren't going to necessarily be picked up on the glucose monitor, but that are important to be cognizant of. And this is, we've really made a big effort in our content and our editorial operations with the company to be very transparent about that like glucose tells you a lot, but it doesn't tell you everything. And here are the other things you have to think about in relation to food above and beyond what your glucose monitor is showing you. And a lot of it comes down to some very, very simple principles, which is eating real, whole, clean foods that have been raised in a responsible way and that are minimally processed. I mean, if this is a lot of what's in the vegan diet, Mark Hyman's book, it's the similar principles. Like glucose monitor can't tell you everything, but if you stick to some of those big picture principles, you're going to be a lot of the way there. So
yeah, nothing can tell you everything, but this is telling you a lot.
A lot, yeah.
Yeah, this is telling you a lot. There's also one other topic that we talked about food pairing, and we talked about how you can use fats and fibers to really help when it comes to especially these naked carbohydrates that you used earlier, which I love that term. We didn't touch on as much about the time restricted eating, because you guys have found out a lot about that area, right? So tell us how that also can play an impact, time restricted eating, continuously eating throughout the day or versus having like a little bit of a narrower window, and how that impacts glucose.
Yeah. So that narrower window can be really helpful for our metabolic health. What you're doing when you're time restricted feeding is it's not about restricting calories. It's just about restricting the amount of time in the 24-hour period that you're eating those calories. And what that's doing is that you're giving yourself all these additional hours in that 24-hour period where you're not spiking glucose and you're not spiking insulin. And what that can do for you is it can improve your insulin sensitivity because you're not continuously stimulating the cells with that insulin signal. And therefore, it can help you with that metabolic flexibility, because when your insulin is low for that greater period of time in that 24-hour window, you're going to work through your glucose stores, the glucose in the circulation, the glucose in the liver. And then you're going to be like, okay, I'm out of this readily accessible glucose. I need to flip and switch into fat burning in order to get energy, because I'm not eating. I don't have exogenous energy coming in. And you can do that because your insulin is low. We know that insulin is a block on fat burning. When insulin's high, you're going to use glucose for energy. You're not going to use fat for energy. So this time-restricted feeding gives you this opportunity to be in a low insulin state, work through your glucose, and then flip into fat burning. And that metabolically flexible state of fat burning when you don't have glucose around, glucose burning when there's readily accessible glucose, that is the healthy state that we want to be in. And there was a great study that was done where they basically took two groups of people and they gave them the exact same number of calories in the 24-hour period. But one group ate between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m., so a 6-hour feeding window, and one group ate between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., a 12-hour feeding window. So that first group was time-restricted feeding. And even though they were eating the exact same number of calories between the two groups, the group that ate in the restricted portion had better overall 24-hour glucose levels, insulin levels, and just overall better metabolic parameters. So yeah, the more we can narrow that window, we give our body this opportunity to essentially tap into metabolic flexibility. If we're just eating essentially from breakfast right when we wake up and like dessert an hour before we go to bed, that's just basically keeping glucose and insulin sort of stimulated all the time, and is unfortunately, you're losing that opportunity to be in a low insulin state and all the potential benefits that can come from that.
Yeah, and again, evolutionary history, it's not how we ate before.
Right.
It's sort of a modern luxury that we can eat that way and constantly be spiking our blood sugar. We were never really, not designed, because I'm not saying that somebody designed us any particular way, but it wasn't part of our of how our genes evolved. We didn't have all these carbohydrates available to us. So let's pivot a little bit into the topic of a level 10 score. 10 is the idea that, when you eat, just like when you work out, you will see some bump, right? Everybody knows that. It's not that you're not trying to have any bump. Well, actually, not everybody knows that. That's why we're explaining it here. So it's natural to have your glucose go up when you eat a little bit. Now, for context, give us a little bit of the ranges, because people know about getting their fasting glucose test from the doctors. Walk us through that, and let's talk about what levels looks at as the optimal ranges. Like, where do we want our blood sugar to be when it comes to the optimal range when we're wearing like a continuous glucose monitor?
Yeah, so talking sort of first about what the standard ranges are. So these are what the governing bodies are telling us are normal. And so when you look at fasting glucose below 100, so 100 or below of a fasting glucose, meaning your glucose when you wake up and you have not had any calories for 8 hours, if that's under 100, you're considered normal, non-diabetic, not pre-diabetic. Between 100 and 125, it's pre-diabetic fasting glucose range. And if you are 126 or above, you're considered to have type 2 diabetes. So what that means is that if you have a fasting glucose of 99 when you walk into the doctor's office, it's very likely the doctor's going to say, you're normal. You have a normal fasting glucose. I think a lot of people are realizing that that might not be the way we should be looking at this, because is 99 really optimal if you're 1 point away from being pre-diabetic? Does that mean that you're totally in the clear? The answer is no. And the research suggests that as you move higher in the normal range towards a pre-diabetic fasting glucose level, your risk for a whole host of diseases, from stroke to heart disease to, of course, developing type 2 diabetes or obesity, all go up very significantly. So if we really dig into the research, it's probably more likely that having a fasting glucose between about 70 and 85 is going to lead to much better health outcomes than if your fasting glucose is 99, even though both are within this bucket category of normal. And so I think there's a real opportunity in the research community to start setting some guidelines around what are optimal ranges as opposed to just normal ranges. Because these ranges that were created, normal, pre-diabetic, diabetic, this is for risk stratification. This is for helping doctors understand, when to prescribe medications, resource allocation, but it's not actually telling us what we should be shooting for optimal health. The same is true for post-meal glucose values. So we think about fasting glucose, which is when you haven't eaten anything for 8 hours, but then we also think about what are the ranges for after you eat something, where do you want to be? So right now, if you look at the International Diabetes Federation, they would say that you want to stay generally under 140 milligrams per deciliter after a meal. So let's say your glucose is 80 before lunch and then goes up and stays under 140 and then comes back down. That's considered to be fine. Again, I would argue that that's probably higher than we want to go after every meal. If you look at actually the literature, they've done quite a few studies where they've put continuous glucose monitors on healthy non-diabetic populations, and the vast majority of time, like well over 90% of the day, people are actually spending their time between a range of 70 and 120. So that's probably closer to where we want to be even after meals, is like under 120. I tend to shoot for like under 110 or 100 or so after meals. So really only getting up at most like 30 points elevated after eating something. So let's say I start at 80, I don't really want to go above 110. If I start at 90, I don't really want to go above 120. So shooting for these narrower ranges, I think, is going to, ultimately lead us to feel better during the day. If I go from 80 to 140 and back down, that's to me going to feel like a pretty big crash. And it's
all part of like a detective work to figure out how different foods respond to you. Like, just being super transparent, I'm reaching here for my phone. I want to tell you kind of about my score yesterday, which was all over the place. And this was kind of, I started off the morning already because I ate a really late meal the night before. We went out with friends. My business partner was in town. We ate with him. So at 5:30, there was a gap in my data, between the night before. So I have my earliest reading for yesterday was 5:42 a.m. and I was already at 93, right? I slept a little bit less, and I had a late meal, which I know impacts things. So that's not usually where I'm at that time. I'm usually a lot lower. So it's just good to see, right? Around, I woke up around like 6 a.m. and there's a increase in glucose when you're waking up in the morning. And then I kind of stabilized a little bit and I got back down to about 90, right? But still not in my optimal direction. Then right before you recorded your podcast with my business partner, I went and grabbed something to eat, right? I jumped all the way up to about 135. And then I immediately slammed down all the way to basically 70, right? So that's that roller coaster that we're talking about. Because I hadn't eaten anything in the morning besides coffee. And then I ate something that spiked me up really high that I hadn't had in a really long time. It was like I think it was like an avocado toast, but I didn't get the gluten-free. I went for the regular one. It was at Bluestone Lane, which is right underneath. And I had a few minutes before I had to jump into the next thing. And I was also curious to see, what would happen. So I spiked up and I went right back down. Then this is the surprising part. I ate something. I went to one of our favorite places here in LA, Air One, which we talk about. And I had something from the hot bar. And I'm still trying to figure out, I don't know what spiked me up, but I basically went right back up to like about 130, right? And sometimes what happens is when people are wearing a monitor, you're not exactly, you're logging it, but maybe kind of retroactively you're logging it a little later on. So part of my goal today is to sort of backtrack and be a detective to see a little bit about what was that food that put me on that up and down roller coaster. Now look, one day, as you've mentioned earlier, one day a little bit here and there, things get off and then you can reset. It's not a big deal. But if this is what your day looks like day in and day out, that's when we really start to have, problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you also bring up a really great point, which is that like you woke up yesterday morning, you had a late meal the night before, you woke up early, and your glucose was maybe a little bit higher than normal. These fasting glucose levels bounce around a huge amount day to day. And based on the current way we track these things, which is you go to the doctor one time per year and you get a fasting glucose check, you'd think that that probably means that these things are very static, like that I'm 85 and that milligrams per deciliter. That's my fasting glucose. That's who I am, but that's not the way it is at all. It bounces around all the time. I could have, the perfect wellness day, like I'm cooking all my food at home, really low glycemic, 10 zone scores for all my meals. I do a high intensity interval training workout. I get 8.5 hours of sleep. I meditated. I took magnesium, And the next day my fasting glucose is like 72. Then the next day, I could get 4 hours of sleep, have a very high carb late meal, not work out and be stressed. And my fasting glucose could be 95. It could be that big of a difference. And to me, that is really empowering because it's like, okay, if I dial in just like a few of these things and make sure I'm kind of like checking off the boxes of my different wellness practices that I know impact my metabolism, I can really move the needle here. It's also when I see that higher number, I'm like, it's okay. This is just a reminder to me that things are kind of off course. I'm not in my homeostasis right now. If I let that happen for weeks and months and years where I'm doing all those behaviors that lead me to have that higher fasting glucose number, no question, that's going to continue going up and that's going to be more of a longer term problem. But
it reminds me of, if I could just add,
yeah,
it kind of reminds me sometimes I'll have this conversation. It's like people are like, I don't want to know all the different numbers. I'm like, okay, how about we try this? When it comes to your bank account, how about I tell you once a year how much money is in your bank account and then try to make financial decisions based on that, right?
Yeah.
You would not know if you were hitting your budget. You wouldn't know if you're overspending, if you're underspending. But at the same time too, if you splurge a little bit one week or you have a fancy meal with your partner a night out and you spend a little bit more money than you wanted to spend, hopefully, knock on wood, if you're in a decent position, it's just one night that you spend a little bit more. Yeah. And then you can adjust appropriately, you adjust the budget. And that's how I see this. I don't want to wait once a year to know how much money I have in my bank account and to see how well I'm doing financially to make sure that I'm saving for retirement and all the other goals that are there. And I also don't obsess on a daily basis of, oh my gosh, I spent so much money today, I'm just going to abandon the whole plan and just fuck it, right? You want to pay attention through the process and see the trends and the averages and see, are you headed in the right direction? Do you have enough money saved for retirement? Can you buy this house that you want to buy? Can you help your parents pay off their mortgage? Can you give X amount to charity that you need to give? And the same thing happens when it comes to, our glucose meters that we have, is we're just looking at these average ones to know. And if we are completely off course with certain things like our breakfast and other stuff, we can start making changes that are there.
Totally. And I think that it does actually, I think, also just build some self-compassion and some self-awareness. I've had people ask me, friends who are like, why do you wear a sleep tracker? Why don't you just wake up in the morning and just see if you're tired or not? And it's like, well, I think the body, it's amazing. It has a huge ability to compensate and sometimes like make us feel like we're doing okay until we're not. I know that like I'm wearing a Whoop right now, and if I get 6 hours of sleep on one night, I might not feel tired the next day. I might be like compensating. I might have caffeine that day or whatever and feel kind of okay. But if that happens every night for 3 weeks, there's almost no question in my mind that I will start to be a little bit more irritable. I will maybe start to feel a little bit down. I will be a little bit anxious. I will not want to work out as much. But for those days leading up to that sort of slow, insidious decline towards FLC, feeling like crap, I might not realize it. But the data actually is showing me to stay on top of it before it's an issue. Now, having worn a sleep tracker for years at this point, I have a better body awareness of like what my body subtly feels like when I haven't gotten a good night's sleep. Like maybe I'm just a little bit more emotional, or I'm just like a little bit more quick to snap at someone or something like that. I might not have necessarily seen those early warning signs if I didn't connect that objective data with the subjective feelings and the choices. And so I do think and then when those things happen, I'm like, oh, this is not me. I am not a person who's in a bad, I'm not just someone who's negative. It's like, I have this compassion for myself of like, oh, of course I'm a little bit more emotional today. I got 6 hours of sleep last night, and I know that I can connect those things now. And I think the same is true for glucose as well. Yes, you might feel that crash and those roller coasters, and you might be able to really feel it day to day. But there's also members we have who say, yeah, I go up and I go down and I don't even really notice something. I don't notice the crash. I don't feel it. And for them, it's like, yeah, I'm so glad I have some awareness into this, like so that I can make a change or intervene before 10 years pass, and then I'm really starting to feel like crap or whatever because things have kind of gone off the rails. So, but at this point, having the objective data with glucose, I do feel like I have a better body awareness of tapping into those internal signals of when my glucose is going all over the place that I might not have realized before. And there's a term for this in medicine, which is, somatic awareness is one term. Interoception is kind of the official medical term. And I love this term. It's basically like, how clued into the internal signals of your body are you? Sensitivity. Yeah. And you can have...
And that word is interoception?
Interoception. Interoception. And you can have gut interoception. You can have... And people check it out on PubMed. It's fascinating. There's thousands of papers on this. Heartbeat interoception is a thing. How much can you just sit silently with yourself and feel your heartbeat and accurate? Some people can't do that. They can't feel their heartbeat. Others can. And the people who can have better cardiovascular outcomes. And that's not surprising to me, because when you can feel the cues of your body, you can make better decisions. You can understand yourself better. So you can imagine, like, if your heartbeat's starting to speed up, like, and you know that, and you're feeling anxious, you can link all those things and have this compassion of like, something's happening and I need to like maybe do my breathing or whatever. But I think glucose interoception is something I'm thinking a lot about, because it's like, if you can start, maybe even without looking at your monitor, have a sense of where you're at. Am I high right now? Am I low right now? And sort of start to balance that out. I think it's a really positive feedback loop. But basically just getting into sort of circling back to what you were saying about your sleep and, kind of cluing into all these different things that led to maybe a fasting glucose being higher in the morning. When you can start to sort of like draw those links, you can start to move the levers for the next day and not get into a situation where months and years go by where you're just kind of letting it happen and you end up in a bad situation.
Yeah, because I think for the most part, weight was the primary thing that people would look at to decide if you were healthy or not, right?
Yeah.
So if there was a lot of excess weight, then you would say that, okay, somebody might not be healthy, at least in the traditional lens of, medicine and even in society. They would look at somebody, they would say, okay, just because this person is on the slimmer side or trimmer side, oh, they must be healthy, because we're judging everything based on weight. And I think that glucose monitors are showing people is that yes, while, obesity is linked with a lot of particular chronic diseases, even people who are trim or slimmer side, I've always been pretty, skinny, growing up and not having a lot of extra weight. You could still end up being skinny fat or have other issues that are there, or just not feel your best, not perform your best, and not have the mental focus that you want to have, not have the energy that you want to have to show up, still getting sick on a regular basis, right, which is a big sign of, fluctuating, glucose and affecting the immune system. While I have you here for a few more minutes, this has been great, by the way. Thank you so much. I'm glad we made this happen. I want to just from your perspective, you do a primarily plant-based diet. I eat a lot of plants, but I don't know if I am by calories, not that I care so much about calories. I don't know if I probably eat a little bit more, meats and fishes and other things, but I still eat a lot of plants that are there. Take us from your perspective, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and or just three meals, but definitely I want to hit on breakfast because that seems to be one that's very challenging. And an example of like what a level 10 score, right? Something that doesn't have a crazy response on your glucose and actually like keeps you pretty stable, which is a goal of having a lot more of those inside of our diet and our routine. So what would be a level 10 score for you for breakfast in the morning?
Yeah. So for me, I think I've shifted my view of what is a normal breakfast, because I think you do have to step outside the box of like, what does the media or marketing show us what breakfast should be, and move towards like a little bit more of a broader view of that. So, and I love traveling, because you start to see breakfasts from other cultures and you realize, wait, breakfast looks a lot like dinner in a lot of these other cultures. Yeah. Like when I was in Japan, it's like, it's fish, it's burdock root, it's seaweed, it's like miso soup for breakfast. And of course, that's going to be all great for glucose.
That's my dream. I would love to eat that for breakfast every day.
Exactly. So I've kind of shifted in that. But if we're talking about traditional breakfast foods, some that have scored 10s, so 10 zone scores, meaning essentially no glucose response, definitely the chia puddings. Those are pretty much universally 10s for me. We've got quite a few recipes on our blog at levelshealth.com/blog. But basically that's like a few tablespoons of chia seeds, some unsweetened non-dairy milk, almond butter, some nuts on top, and like a little bit of low glycemic fruit, like some berries or cherries or raspberries or something like that. That for me will be like a no glucose response. There are some grain-free granolas, like keto granolas, that are pretty good. Paleonola is one that I've tried at Whole Foods that caused no glucose response for me. So that on top of like unsweetened cashew yogurt with some chia seeds on top, and maybe like a couple berries, like that'll be a 10 zone score for me. I have tried, eggs a few times, and like basically a couple pasture-raised eggs with avocado and some greens, 0 glucose response.
That's pretty typical of my breakfast.
Yeah.
I'll do a little bit of like, me and my fiance, we make like a little bit of like our own version of a charcuterie plate for breakfast. So we'll have some smoked salmon, wild caught smoked salmon. We'll have some eggs. We'll have some olives, maybe even, or some guacamole that was left over for dinner. And that is like my favorite type of breakfast.
Totally. Like for people who do eat animal products, I would say like probably the ultimate breakfast would be exactly what we were just talking about, like a couple pastured free range eggs, some greens, some avocado or guacamole or something, and then maybe some fish like sardines or smoked salmon or something like that. You're getting the omega-3s, you're getting the greens and the polyphenols. You're getting the healthy fats from the avocado, and you're getting tons of micronutrients. So that meal, I would guess for most people, is going to have 0 glucose, like 5 to 10 point rise on glucose. But for me, a lot of what I do when I'm on the go actually is I just grab like a Daily Harvest, which is a brand, like a direct-to-consumer frozen food company. But what I love about them is that they are mostly grain-free, they're organic, they support regenerative farms, and it's all plant-based. And so I'll just grab a Harvest bowl, which are their like sort of more savory meals, and they're generally based on like cauliflower rice or broccoli rice, or sometimes lentils as well. And then they just create great flavors. Like they have a cauliflower rice pesto bowl, which kind of tastes like pesto pasta, but it's made with cauliflower rice. And so I'll just grab one of those, throw it in the microwave for 5 minutes, and then take that with me, for breakfast. And that's usually like 0. And so I post a lot of these on social media just to show like you can be plant-based and eat these like big, beautiful meals and have very, very minimal glucose response. I also throw beans into everything. Like for me, beans don't spike me. For some people, they actually do. Beans and lentils can be spikers, but for me, and I don't know if it's microbiome or maybe it's because I'm pairing them often with fat and protein, I'll add, tahini, or I'll make a nut butter sauce for my beans. But I love them for the fiber, and fiber tends to really keep my glucose lower. So when I add fiber to a meal, it really helps. So that's sort of what I'll do for breakfast is like chia, unsweetened non-dairy yogurts, or really just like a very vegetable forward type of more like savory breakfast.
Let's talk about some meals for later in the day. I mean, you can combine lunch and dinner because you're probably pretty much eating similar things for those. Give us an example of maybe a couple of meals that are in that same category, right? What are you looking to put together?
Yeah. So, I mean, for lunch, one of the things I love, a creative outlet for me, honestly, is thinking about like foods that I love or foods that are common and popular and just how to make them more nutrient dense, cleaner, and lower glucose response. So for lunch, a lot of people want to go for like a sandwich or something like that. Well, how can you really just like up level your sandwich from a nutrient perspective, but also lower glucose? Well, first thing you can do is you can swap out the bread for other things. So you could do like a nut flour based bread, like an almond flour bread, or you could use greens. So like I love using collard greens as a wrap for.
My favorite is Napa cabbage. It's so structured and you can make like a taco, a sandwich out of it. Like I know that sounds crazy to people, but this weekend we made Napa cabbage tacos. Me and my brother-in-law, who's a cardiologist, also, rocking his continuous glucose monitor and everything. It was fantastic.
So good. I mean, my favorite food, I used to live in Portland, Oregon, was this millet burger in a collard green wrap from this Whole Foods plant-based restaurant called Pixie Retreat. And I dream about it. I crave it. It's got a cashew mayo, and but it's just you're eating multiple collard greens in this thing, and it's delicious. So I think swapping out, you mentioned Napa cabbage, collard greens, just nice iceberg lettuce. You can cut it into squares and use that as like almost like a burger like bun. And then butter lettuce is fabulous for tacos, like for small tacos. I also love using nori sheets. So actually seaweed, you can buy the large, they're almost like a foot by a foot at Whole Foods. And you can use those as a burrito shell. And they have virtually no carbohydrates. And seaweed has so many good nutrients for you. So again, we have lots of these recommendations on the Levels blog. But there's just so many ways to have that lunch food that you like with this alternative. So a lot of what I do is I'll make like veggie stir fries with beans, with tofu, and then put them in a greens wrap like this and put some tahini on top. And again, it's just trying to get as many nutrients as possible without the glucose spike, and always trying to source as clean ingredients as I can, organic, low pesticides, and when I can really support regenerative farms.
Totally. And I think one really cool thing, your business partners and co-founders have written about this on the blog, is that a lot of developments, for anybody who's listening and is really thinking about, in Mark's last book, Food Fix, it was all about like, how do we make this more accessible? How do we help people? Other stuff. We have to remember that most advancements in technology initially start off and they're going to be higher end, right? They're going to be not available to everybody. But as we continue to get more people involved, we start to make this available for more people. We bring the cost down, other stuff. I can imagine a world one day where health insurance companies are so excited to pay for this because they see that it makes healthier citizens long term, especially the people who have the most expensive diseases that cost a lot to treat. This preventative medicine is way cheaper to do in comparison to a lot of the way that things happen. And so I'm imagining a future where anybody who wants it could have access to these glucose monitors. Maybe companies are subsidizing it. I actually think that we'll probably see that first, kind of like with Virta Health and diabetes. We'll see companies that are saying like, holy crap, if I give all of my employees this monitor, or at least subsidize it to a certain degree, it's creating healthier employees and our premiums are going to go down, right? So this is the path. Is first, it starts off with education. We have to do podcasts like this, the education you guys do on your blog, to make people aware of something that they previously were not aware of. And that's an important part of the process. Then it's technologies, and technologies can be new and interesting foods or ways to deliver them, but it also can be wearables, which is where you guys are at, to give that instantaneous biofeedback and help with the interoception process of increasing the sensitivity. So that's where we are. And I'm very thankful that we have a device that can help people who are interested in going down that pathway to increase the sensitivity between what they eat and how they feel, and also how they work out in their glucose and how they sleep in their glucose, and just make them in much more of the category of optimal health. I want to help people, yes, avoid cancer and Alzheimer's and those other things, but I also just as much want to help a lot of young people tap into what is the most optimal version of their health right now in this moment.
Absolutely. And I think, your podcast does this just in such a monumental, huge way and helps people really learn. I mean, I think knowledge is power, and both education and also devices that help us learn about our bodies can help us with that knowledge. And yeah, we are living in a really complex time, and it really is an uphill battle to be healthy. You have to be going against the tide of normal culture in order to be healthy in our modern Western world. If you just go on the normal route, the normal treadmill, you will probably end up with chronic disease. And by that, I mean eating processed food, drinking sodas, being sedentary, allowing chronic low-grade stress to dominate your life and not sleeping an adequate amount, eating micronutrient-poor foods, not supporting our microbiome, and being exposed to environmental toxins in all of our, personal care products, home products, foods. So that's the lowest, that's the easiest way to live, is just to basically, be exposed to all those things. And so we got, if we want to go against the tide, I think, tools can be helpful. They can be something we can grasp onto to help motivate us and help us to feel community around doing it differently and doing it in a way that we're being empowered and we're taking control of our own health and kind of taking that control back. And that just really excites me a lot. I think when we understand how our bodies work and how our environment is affecting our bodies, and really focus on the word understanding, anything is possible.
You said something really interesting earlier, and it made me think. There's a financial author, his name is Dave Ramsey, and I used a lot of his material when I was in college and my finances were all over the place, and I had a company and it was doing well, but I wasn't managing my finances. He said, you know what? My method may look weird, but if normal is broke, right? Most people normally are broke. They don't have the financial resources that they want. I'd rather be weird. And so the same thing comes to health. If normal is sick, I'd rather be weird. And I think that's what you're helping people do. You're helping them get a little weird with this device that they wear in their arm. Dr. Casey Means, this has been fantastic. If people want to get a little weird with us, where can they go to sign up? I think we have a special link for them for the Levels website. Right now it's invitation only. You guys still have like a kind of a beta invite only group, but I think we have a link for our podcast listeners, which is just levelshealth.com/Dhru, DHRU, I believe.
Levels.link/Dhru.
Yes, levels.link. It's the short version of it. Levels.link. It's the first link in the show note. And on YouTube, anybody can find it. You can click on that. If you want to get weird with us and you want to wear this and feel your best, you can sign up for it over there. And you guys are putting out great content, both as a company and also yourself personally. Would love for you to mention where people can go if they want to continue down the education journey.
Yeah, levelshealth.com/blog is just an amazing resource. I mean, fabulous authors, Ben Bickman, David Perlmutter, writing incredible articles about why metabolic health is health and why we all need to think about it far before the time when we might get a diagnosis of a metabolic condition like diabetes. So check it out. There's articles that are relevant really to anyone. If it's acne, if it's wrinkles, if it's PCOS, if it's erectile dysfunction, if it's heart disease, it's all there and it's all research based. So check out that, levelshealth.com/blog. Can also sign up for our newsletter, which, condenses a lot of this great information. And then if you want to join the wait list, you can sign up on our homepage, levelshealth.com, or use the link that Dhru mentioned. And then we're on Instagram and Twitter @Levels, which is actually really fun to follow our Instagram @Levels, because our members who are in the beta program are sharing the experiments they're doing. And it can give you a lot of really interesting ideas about, comparing different foods and different athletics and, activities and kind of get inspired by some of that. And then I'm at Dr. Casey's Kitchen, Dr. Casey's Kitchen on Instagram and Twitter as well. And I post a lot about plant-based metabolic health.
I love it. We'll have the links to all those again. And you guys have a wait list now, but if they use the link, they can skip it.
They skip the wait list.
Okay,
yeah.
great. If you want to skip it, Click on the link and you can sign up and you can share your experiments with us at YouTube. If you like this interview with Dr. Casey Means, you're going to love this interview with Dr. Ben Bickman, all on how to burn fat the right way.
So insulin resistance it really is an epidemic that is the single most common health disorder in the world. In the US alone, it affects potentially up